I want to introduce Jacob. Jacob Rosenberg we're going to have a dialogue. We've never done this before, so we're going to try something different. Here was the basic idea of how this came about. As opposed to everyone talking about what's happening at a college campus, and everyone telling each other what's happening on a college campus, I thought actually maybe we should talk to someone who's on a college campus, namely a junior at college in this case, and hear from him about his own experiences. That's the theory that we're going to try to accomplish tonight. I'm going to just ask Jacob some questions, and he's going to share about his experiences. And if we have time, we will open it up for questions from the congregation. So let me just tell you a little bit about Jacob. Jacob is studying legal studies and finance at Wharton and is a member of Sigma Alpha Mu fraternity. This past summer, he traveled to Israel as a Tamid Summer Fellow. Tamid offers college students experiential business learning opportunities there in Israel. In high school, he participated in Project Understanding, a joint trip to Israel for Jewish and Catholic students, as well as Seeds of Peace, a program that brings together Jews and Palestinians so that they can learn more about each other and each other's narratives. Also, Jacob, we forgot to mention in your bio that you were bar mitzvahed at Congregation Lador Vador, which I know set the chart and set you on the way to accomplish all of these things. So, Jacob, you'll come to the bima. Jacob's going to stand here at this microphone. I'm going to continue to stand at my microphone, as I always do. And I'm going to ask Jacob some questions, and we're going to hear from him. So again, I just want to also frame this. I told Jacob and reassured him, his expertise is his experience at college. That's what he's talking about and sharing with us. And he is at Penn, which has been in the news of late about some of the things that have been going on there. So, first of all, Jacob, welcome to the Bima.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that very nice introduction. And yeah, I think that's a really important point about where my expertise is, which is my own subjective experiences, not an expert political commentator, but also, everyone has their own story, whether it's at my school, at Penn's campus, or in a lot of different campuses across the country. So I'm going to speak to my own experience, and that's as a Jewish student at Penn. So yeah, it's a good.
So tell us a little bit about the activities that you're involved in at Penn, in particular the Jewish stuff that touches on Jewish experiences and activities.
Sure. So I'd say probably the most relevant one to this experience is just I'm in a Jewish fraternity, Sigma Alpha Mu, and I live in the house, so there's a lot of Jewish students around me all the time, and then that kind of permeates into the social world that I live in, so always kind of surrounded by a very strong Jewish community, and for the last 3 years that's felt very secure and stable, and so it'll be interesting to talk about how that's evolved. But beyond that, I'm also, as you mentioned, part of Tamid, which is a program that focuses on business-oriented learning through the lens of Israel, and that's through a consulting project that I'm working on as a project manager this semester, and then also this past summer where I did the fellowship in Israel. So that's connected to Penn's campus, but also a lot of different campuses across the country, and they all have their different chapters of Tamid. So those two outlets are I would highlight, and then Tamid actually meets in the Hillel building, so I'm there constantly. They also have a pretty good dining hall, so that's another good reason to go there. And yeah, so those are the main ways that I connect with Judaism.
Those are good. That's so. We're going to use October 7th is obviously a dividing line, and part of what I've asked Jacob to reflect on is sort of differences before and after. So let's start with before.
Yeah.
If you can just sort of reflect, positive experiences vis-a-vis your Jewish involvement and your Jewish identity before October 7th, and negative that may have happened before that date.
Yeah, so really for the first 2 and change years at Penn, it's all been positive. As I mentioned, a lot of my friends are Jewish, and I have friends outside of those Jewish circles as well. Not saying that, I'm a pretty popular guy. No, that's not what I'm saying. But
you can say that here. It's a safe space. So.
No, but those have all been very positive experiences, and just, I've always felt very comfortable with I'm a Reformed Jew, but there's also a lot of people who are varying levels of orthodoxy, or varying levels of ways that they engage with the faith. Some within some of my close friends keep kosher, etc. And then there's communities like the Orthodox community at Penn. They have their own floor in one of the high-rise buildings. That's the second floor, so that for observing Shabbat, they don't have to use the elevator. There's plenty of very safe spaces for Jews, and I've always felt very safe and warm and comfortable in that community. Certain holidays when I haven't come home, I've been able to go to Hillel and go to a service there. So that's been the first 2 years. And then I would put, there's definitely one clear marker on October 7th of when these changes started to happen. But
before we get to October 7th, I just want to talk, because I really want to try to set the framework beforehand. So you're saying you didn't really experience any anti-Semitism before October 7th?
Definitely not before. The other marker I was going to mention is that there was this event that came up on campus about a month before October 7th, where there's something called the Palestine Rights Festival, where there was a literature festival for Palestinian artists and poets and the like that were going around, and they were making a stop and to be hosted by Penn. And it was, in a lot of ways, a very good thing to celebrate a different culture and to have these very famous speakers and poets and artists be able to have a platform. But what ended up happening was there were a lot of speakers that were slated to come and speak at Penn that were drawing a lot of controversy for previous anti-Semitic or purportedly anti-Semitic things that they had said or done. Specifically, Roger Waters was a big one. I'm sure many of you are familiar, but very famous singer, and famous for what he's done that is very anti-Semitic. And so that became a controversy about a month before October 7th, and that was probably the first time that I've had to engage with some of these questions of my feelings of safety and anti-Semitism on campus. But then, obviously, October 7th was the next marker.
But just let's focus on that writers' conference.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that conference? Did it raise fear among your fellow Jewish students? Was there examples of anti-Semitism that came out of that conference?
It definitely raised fears among my fellow students. I would say that I was probably on the side closer to not very concerned, and I've heard a lot of people with similar commentary in the last few weeks saying that we've really underestimated anti-Semitism in this country, especially recently, and there's been a very strong sense of security. So I think with the Writers' Festival, I really didn't give it too much thought. Some of my friends were very concerned. There was a petition going around trying to get the school to crack down on it or cancel it. A lot of the donors, who will come up later, also had a lot to say about the festival being held and the university's handling of it. And there's a ton to get into here that we don't need to spend time on, and the way that the school was introduced to the festival. Some people think they were hoodwinked into exactly how it went down, but there was definitely, the people around me were, long and short of it, I was a little bit less concerned than them. I've always been very hard in the camp of free speech. The solution to speech that you don't like is actually more speech, and so I felt that was appropriate. When there was people who are going to be speaking that I found morally reprehensible in one way or another, I was in favor of letting them speak and then speaking out against them. That was generally how I felt about the Palestine Rights Festival.
So that event didn't shake you personally?
No, it didn't shake me, and when it came and went, I think it ended up happening in a sort of abridged version of what was planned to happen. I know Roger Waters spoke over Zoom because the school wouldn't let him come in person, but pretty much, it happened, and then we sort of moved on, and then October 7th happened.
All right, so then let's October 7th, what changed after? Can you give us concrete examples of things that changed specifically on campus after October 7th?
Yeah, there's a bunch, so I don't want to miss any, but I think the most obvious ones are the protests and the counter-protests that we've seen. So people will gather in front of, there's something called the Love Statue. There's a bunch of different places on Penn's campus that people will gather and have signs and speeches and all that. Also, probably major, noticeable, and every day has been social media. Those darn kids and their social media. It's true. So there's obviously people posting these things in their Instagram stories, like infographics about one side or the other of the conflict. But then the most relevant to me is there's this platform called Side Chat, which is basically it's similar to Reddit, if you're familiar with that. But it's specifically for Penn students and it's every school has their own version of a dialogue platform for their school, so that's ours. So people are really hashing out the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in side chat forum, and it got pretty, ugly, and there was definitely some things that rubbed me the wrong way. I felt compelled to
There's some
respond.
things that you thought were anti-Semitic that were said?
Definitely, and so I felt compelled to respond, and I got sucked into reading all the posts, and it was, thousands and thousands of people at my school are engaging with these messages. Specifically, some I can highlight. I wrote down just in case we want to get them exactly, but 1.6 thousand people upvoted, which means liked, a message that called Israel's government terrorizers and occupiers and killers of Palestinians, and so. It's definitely, that opened my eyes a lot, just the fact that you can see the number of people liking these messages, and then also engage in real time with people who have the anonymity of the internet and can say anything. So the side chat is definitely one I would highlight. And then there's the fact that there were posters hung up all around the school, which were, I'm sure you've seen them, the bring them home hostages pictures, and actually there was some person videotaped tearing down those posters, and that went viral on the internet, I'm sure you saw, and that's happened at a few other places now as well, but those come to mind as,
Were there any physical attacks of people, or something, anything said to friends or to you?
Yes, so there was, one of my closest friends actually was in CVS and had a horrible experience where someone called him a pig. Somehow they knew he was Jewish, even though, he wasn't. I don't know how they knew he was Jewish, but it was pretty clearly a disgusting, anti-Semitic, hateful act. There was also emails sent to professors and to Hillel staff that were supposedly hateful, violent threats. And so every time something like this happens, the president, Liz McGill, will send out a message to the whole Penn community explaining it. And this, has become very relevant because the university's reaction has become a central focus point in this discussion. And those reactions have changed a lot in the weeks after October 7th. But since, things like messages being cast on buildings that were, in the form of a pro-Palestine protest, so they had things like from the river to the sea on the walls. So a lot of these, things have happened, and then the school responds with an email saying we condemn hate in all forms, things like that.
So I'm going to push you a little bit on this. How do you feel about the school's response?
That's a great question. So I'm pretty conflicted, and it's changed a lot. But I just want to, before we move on quickly, I wanted to point out a few more tangible. The way I was breaking it down to myself in preparing for this is there's some explicit forms of hate that we've seen. Things like my friend being called a pig, the threats, the people ripping down the posters, the side chat.
There was also the Israeli flag stolen.
Yes, so there was one student who went viral in a video calling the October 7th attacks glorious, and then was arrested for stealing an Israeli flag from an Orthodox community's house. And she was my year, by the way. And then the last thing was there was vandalism on the A.E. Pie house. Shout out Joshua. And it said, anti-Semitic vandalism.
You guys are not in the same fraternity?
No.
All right, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later. So those are the tangible acts of hate, of anti-Semitism we saw. And then I want to talk more about the implicit acts later. I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss any of those. And then what was your last question?
How do you feel about the university's response?
Yes, okay. So,
that's been very controversial, and I want to know how a student feels about it.
That's been one of the biggest controversies for a while now at Penn's campus, because it started with the Palestine Rights Festival. A lot of the biggest donors to the school are either Jewish or feel very connected to these issues and have voiced their concerns to Liz McGill and the university's administration. And so that over time we've seen differences in their responses. But in the first few days after the attack, there was pretty much no response, no explicit condemnation of Hamas, and then people
from the university.
From the university. So then people started pulling their funding, and it was all these major headlines. A few very prominent Wall Street fellas had taken their money out, and so that I'm now. So the question was about how I feel about their response, because since then they've done a lot more. They've sent a lot of emails with very strong language calling out anti-Semitism. They set up a task force for anti-Semitism. There's, channels to report any hate crimes or events. They've been communicating with the FBI about things like the emails targeting professors, with explicit violent threats. So I feel, in the emails that I've read, I've always felt, that's what I want her to be saying. And the other side of it is, it's almost gone too far to the extent that it's fed into the narrative of the anti-Jewish stereotype of the rich Jew pulling the strings, and people have gone to side chat and said similar things where it's, these donors are pulling their money, and then the school is, following their lead, and Liz McGill, that people accuse her of just fighting for her job, and so she'll say whatever she wants to have her job because she's losing all this money. And so a lot of the Arab population at the school feels like they've been left out to dry because all these messages are condemning anti-Semitism, and they perceive there to be a feeling of insecurity for them and Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, and that portion of the campus feels like the emails have gone the other direction. But then again, a lot of my friends feel like Liz McGill has not responded sufficiently, has not condemned the violence enough, has not taken tangible actions to make sure that an environment where these kinds of hateful things can happen can't be allowed. So it's clearly very complicated, very strong opinions on both sides. And I am concerned about the narrative that rich Jews are pulling the strings. I don't obviously it's a horrible thing to say, but the fact that people have used this as evidence really makes me upset. But that's kind of an idea of what's been going on with the emails and the donors, and you feel free to make your own judgments. I'm kind of conflicted, as you can tell. But
that's all right. You don't have to have it all figured out.
Yeah.
Do you have, just out of curiosity, do you have friendships that friends who have contrary views to yours about Israel? Who don't necessarily share your narrative or our narrative about Israel?
Yeah, I definitely do, and there's a few different camps here. Like I've tried to engage in dialogue with people who I know have the opposite view, and have had varying degrees of successes there. But I think the most.
What would constitute success?
Well, there's this person in my anthropology class that I was walking with after class one day, and we walked past. There was a vigil for Palestinians killed in Gaza, and we started talking about the conflict, and immediately had very different sides, and then we got pretty far. He was not very educated on the topic, and so it was more me explaining what I knew about it as opposed to arguing with him about it. I think that in and of itself is telling, though, because a lot of people who have a surface level understanding of the conflict are in this world of oppressed, and they see that as a very simple dichotomy, and then the answer is easy for them. They see Israel with these easy categories as a settler colonialist state or an apartheid or a genocide, whatever it is, and then that makes the calculation so much easier to them because they're digesting it in the form of an infographic. So I definitely, so that was a meaningful experience because it showed me how many of my fellow students with a surface level understanding of the issue are jumping to these conclusions that become very upsetting to me. But I think I had a very meaningful conversation, or a few of them, with some of the people who live in my house, both Jewish students, but two of my close friends. We've had a few conversations, so I can highlight some of those topics for you. I'm pretending not to look at my cheat sheet here.
It's okay.
But yeah, so Oh yeah, so we had a few. These are all very, very interesting conversations, and we left with different levels of mutual understanding and a little bit of tension. But the relationships are definitely fine, and we can have these conversations and still be very good chums. But one conversation was about the doctrine of Islam, the doctrine of Christianity, the doctrines of Judaism, and if there is an inherent tie to violence in the doctrines of Islam as manifested in the radical Islamic terrorism that Hamas represents. And we talked about whether that's the ultimate cause of the violence we're seeing, or if you have to go one step deeper, look at the political, economic, social situation of these Middle Eastern places where Islamic militancies emerge. And then my answer to that was, you were talking about finding the cure and fighting the symptoms, and I think you have to do both. And if the symptom of the evil is what Hamas, is Al Qaeda, is ISIS, you can't just stop at we can justify it with these political, social, economic factors which cause people to manifest their hate through Islam. Like the contention is this violence, we would see this violence anyway because they're suffering. And I think that may be true to some extent, but it is also true that the doctrine of Islam is being leveraged to execute this violence. And so you can fight the violence while also fighting the root factors at the same time. And if we're having a lack of success fighting the root factors, as we know America and Israel have taken certain actions that we can debate about for years about trying to encourage political, economic, social stability in these regions, and they failed. I'm talking about this for a long time, I'm realizing. But anyway, yeah, that's the point about Islam, is that you can find the cure and you can fight the symptoms at the same time. The other things we talked about, we debated, is from the river to the sea, a hateful form of speech that shouldn't be permitted on a college campus. Is it a call for genocide, or is it a element of a well-reasoned political doctrine that should be allowed in the spirit of free speech on a college campus? We talked about cultural relativism.
So what is your view on that phrase?
Great question. I think
I like how he throws me praise. It's very nice.
It's hard because, well, so
Just your opinion.
Yes. Well, my opinion is not fully formed. But when I pushed back on this on the phone with my dad a little while ago, and the answer that I came up with was, in the form of an analogy, during the American Revolutionary War, if someone was to say, from Florida to Maine, America shall be free, would I have interpreted that as a call for genocide against the British people? And I wouldn't. But then Rabbi Moskowitz brought up a very good point, which is if they had said, from the East Coast to the West Coast, America will manifest our destiny and America will be free, during that period of expansion. That was, in effect, a call for the genocide of Native Americans. But then the argument becomes, is it calling for the genocide, or is it calling for something that you want, right? The freedom of Palestine, which you can want without inherently wanting the death of Jews, but then the only way to effectuate that change is through the death or through the forced migration of Jews. It becomes very difficult. So I believe, because it's a very nuanced question and it's not totally clear, I err on the side of free speech. And if I was king, I would allow people at a protest to say, from the river to the sea. But I think that speaks to the thing that question speaks to is that what I'm more worried about than the explicit anti-Semitism and the graffiti of swastikas and the calling people horrible names, everyone condemns that unilaterally at my school. What scares me a lot more is the from the river to the sea, is the 1.6 thousand people liking a message that calls Israel, a terrorizer, an occupier, whatever, because these are much more of gray areas if we can explicitly call them anti-Semitism. And because they're gray areas, we get to see a lot more of just how many people are supporting these views and how many people are creating a moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, and how many people are, misinformed by these narratives that are so distinct from one another. So that scares me a lot more. And the people who see the world so clearly as oppressor and oppressed and don't need to know anything about the history or the context, they can just say Israel is a white, westernized country terrorizing a population that's helpless. Those are the things that bother me a lot more even than the explicit anti-Semitism. It's the difficulty in targeting what anti-Semitism actually is.
So when we were talking earlier, one of the things it's obviously much easier to label something anti-Semitic if someone's wearing a hood or wearing a Nazi uniform than it is in the gray space that you're talking about. It's a much more complicated and nuanced. Someone could be saying from the river to the sea, and what they mean is a democratic state for that whole region, which would of course be the end of the Jewish state, but not necessarily it'd be the end of the Jewish state of Israel, but not necessarily calling for Israel's destruction. And I think that's the problem in terms of it depends on who you're talking to. And the other piece that we were realizing when we were discussing and debating this is that everyone seems to want to put sort of the familiar categories that they have of colonizer and put it on this discussion when it doesn't fit. And they just want to paint it with this wide brush, like, I've learned about this category of oppression, and so it must apply everywhere in the entire world, when obviously every conflict is different.
It's a very interesting and important point. And funny enough, I mentioned my anthropology class, but we talk a lot about this concept and about how we can socially construct concepts in our lives by creating these categories, and then once the categories exist, which are already imperfect, amorphous characterizations of entities we observe in life, as soon as we create a category, that becomes our security blanket, our default. Then all the things at the edges of those categories, we contour them inside of that category, and then it makes looking at the world, which is a very messy and complicated place, so much easier, because we have these, we can say colonialism, we can say genocide, we can say apartheid, and we know what those things mean to us. Those are bad. And so if we can ascribe behavior we're confused about to categories we're clear about, then we make much easier judgments about those behaviors that we're confused about.
Yeah,
It's a dangerous trap.
And it's also forcing things into a box that they don't necessarily belong in.
Yeah.
So we do have some time for maybe a few questions from those who are in the congregation. Bruce, if I'll turn on the mic if you turn it on too. Does anyone have a question? No? Got to use the mic, Jeff, so everybody can hear you online.
Okay. First, Jacob, excellent presentation, very impressive. Do you wear your yarmulke around campus?
It's a very good question. I do not, and I was thinking about that because, again, I'm speaking from my own experience, and there's plenty of students who are much more explicitly Jewish than I am, and probably have a lot more to say about the fear that they feel on a daily basis. Versus me, I would say this kind of melds into the background a lot during my day-to-day life, and then I'll hear another story or I'll look at the news and it'll come back to the forefront. But yeah, I'll let you continue. But it's a very good point. Everyone has their own experience.
Just a couple of comments too. I mean, Penn sort of has a reputation as where a lot of Jewish students, especially Long Island, Westchester, go. So it's pretty shocking for most of us to see, how vicious it's been there, or at least it's seemingly vicious. And then just to go back to the comment about the river to the sea and context and nuance, my feeling is like there's just too much context and nuance is just such an excuse for what is so obviously a hateful slogan and used hatefully and spoken hatefully. And that's such bogus, that context and nuance, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a fair criticism. It really is. But I would just push back on that a little bit and say, maybe to you that's clear for From the River to the Sea, but how about Free Palestine? Is that the same level of clarity of inacceptability? And then you can move back to any of the popular slogans that maybe there's only one solution, Intifada revolution. I hear that chant all the time. To me that sounds worse than From the River to the Sea, because to us the intifadas are that calls up a very very awful memory, many very awful memories. But to them, the word intifada just means uprising or revolution, and that's another element is as soon as you go into translation, you get to different conclusions. I guess my point is, drawing those lines is very, very difficult, and I don't know who I trust to draw those lines. I don't know if I trust my school's administration to draw those lines. I don't know if I trust them to draw that in the other direction to what the pro-Israel protesters are allowed to chant or allowed to say. It's very line drawing is very difficult, is my point, and that's why I always err on the side of letting people say what they want to say in free speech. But there's certain things that I would definitely not be comfortable with people saying and that are much more clear to me. So, I appreciate the comment and the question, I guess, is what I'm saying.
I have another question. Do your professors, in any class, are you engaging in the discussion of what's going on? I mean, maybe not in a math class, but
No.
I don't know. Are the teachers bringing it up?
Not really any of my classes, to be honest. I'm, in the business school, so they're mostly business-oriented, and it would be kind of awkward to just insert them. There have definitely been times that I talk about them with students in my class, and there are many classes that are much more related to this area where I'm sure they're talking about it every day, but in my stat class, we're not talking about it.
Okay, one
Yeah, but
more
wait,
question.
I just want to remind Jacob of something, and if you can just reflect on it.
Yeah.
Because when we were talking earlier, you were saying that you have you feel like you've checked yourself more out in
yes.
public in terms of what you'll say out loud, if
Yeah.
you will, about Israel or about your Jewishness since October 7th, that you've noticed a change about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. There have been a few times when I catch a hint of awkwardness in the conversation as the topic comes up, and then I start to pick up on the fact that there's two very strong different views, and then I do the internal calculation of, is it worth it to get into a 30-minute conversation right now? That's happened a few times, and there have been other times when I was sitting at dinner with my friends and I started talking about the conflict, and then they shushed me and they're like, you don't know who could be listening, we shouldn't talk about this in public. And that's just so antithetical to the way that I live my life, and believe that a college campus is a place for openness and free speech, and you should be comfortable saying whatever you believe. But as I said, even I find myself, myself catching myself and saying, I should be careful. I don't want to hurt this person's feelings. I don't want to say the wrong thing, the quote wrong thing. So,
And that's a change?
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely other topics that, I find that I have opinions on that I find myself just saying it's not worth it to get into this right now because, it's definitely a part of the culture. It's a shift where there's certain things that are considered off limits that I just have learned in my time. I've learned pretty slowly, but I've learned that they're not worth bringing up anymore. But definitely it's a change when it comes to Israel. I feel like I've felt pretty comfortable with all things Israel and Judaism for the first few years of college.
Jody, you had another
Yeah,
question.
one more thing. I just, because, we hear so much, and it's kind of hard to gauge, like, how real is, like, the fear? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, you go to sleep at night in your fraternity. Are people afraid that people are gonna throw rocks at them? I mean, you're
Right.
walking around campus. Like, how real is the everyday fear, do you think, for Jewish students?
So for
now?
me, there really is none, if I'm being honest. I think part of that might be me being naive, but I don't think about it on a regular basis in terms of I'm afraid to leave my house at a certain part of night, or I'm afraid to, I don't wear a yarmulke in public, but that might be part of it. But I will say, there are more and more touch points for me to notice the conflict now. One of the responses from the administration was to send police to regularly check in on Jewish buildings and organizations. So every morning the police swing by my fraternity house. Luckily, nothing going on there that would concern the police. That's good. But yeah, it's been that's a touch point where I'm thinking about. As soon as I see the police officer, I'm reminded of the situation, and it makes me sad, and I thank them for helping us. But no, to answer your question, I'm not going to sleep at night fearing, but I'm sure I've seen that there are people who do. I've heard people say that. It's just I can only speak from my own experience.
Are there any other questions? Okay, so I want to ask you one last question, which is, if you read the news, anti-Semitism on the college campus is a huge problem, and it's increased, dramatically. I mean, what would be your sort of final evaluation about that on this night, obviously?
Well, yeah, I would say it really is a big problem. I think it should be addressed on its own as anti-Semitism, and I think it should be addressed more collectively as what scares me not much more, but what scares me as well, as I mentioned, which is just the cultural shift of getting all our information in infographics, not having any interest in context or in the nuance of a situation, the easy oppressor-oppressed categorization, those kinds of things destroy democracy. That scares me. I think we should be able to. That's the whole thesis of Seeds of Peace, the program Rabbi mentioned earlier. Dialogue and shining a light on difficult, contentious issues is the best solution to them. And we're not doing that, certainly in a time when we're afraid to even say what we believe. So the anti-Semitism scares me, and then the consequences of the anti-Semitism scare me, and the causes of these feelings that I'm having, that status quo of how dialogue functions on a college campus, which is supposed to be the bastion of free speech, and it just doesn't exist anymore. So that's what scares me more.
Yeah, but the sad thing that you pointed out to me is that that wonderful dialogue that you experienced with Seeds of Peace in high school hasn't continued.
Yeah, not at all. There's one group chat. This was now back in the middle of high school, so several years ago now. But at the end of that program, Israeli and Palestinian teenagers were hugging each other. They were friends. They were going to sleepaway camp together and playing soccer and football and doing cooking and flirting with girls. They were all doing that with each other, and then
Or flirting with boys too.
Oh, and that's true too. Yeah. And then now they don't even talk to each other. And when they do, the last text exchange that happened in that big group chat was sadly on the morning of October 7th. One of the Palestinian students sent a link to a chess match to the whole group chat, essentially mocking the Israelis, basically inviting them to play a game of chess on the morning that this terrorist attack had happened. Basically, that's in a nutshell, the state of how these people who had been brought to love each other through this awesome program of dialogue now see each other. So it's really indicative of how all of these narrative crossroads have broken down and we're just in our echo chambers and not willing to talk to one another.
No, I think that was a sad note that you shared with me. That's, after so much progress, was that 4 years ago that you did the program?
Something like that, yeah.
That after all of that progress, everyone sort of reverted into their silos in a sense, and to their comfortable sort of narrative, and are holding to that. Look, I want to commend you for speaking to the congregation and sharing your experience. Jacob, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone,
You
for
can
your
clap
time.
for him. It's okay. I want to thank Jacob for sharing with us his wisdom and his experience on the college campus. I do think it's really important to listen to our college students, and not just to talk about what's happening at college, but actually talk to them and find out what their experiences are. And I would like to believe that, as difficult as this is to do now, that the answer, the college is founded on the principle that we have to confront ideas that make us uncomfortable. We have to confront people who we disagree with and try to figure out what our own place is there. And so I would hope that we're able to return to that ethos someday, and that we're able to find our way out of this conflict and these difficulties. And so I pray for certainly better days ahead. But thank you again for sharing and for your willingness to do so.